he's quite a utopian, the openness to experience and also to the transformative nature of experience and the transformative nature of what, say, cinema could do or what radio does, and the idea that, these are transhuman prostheses which are going to extend our ranges of perception.
This is what a lot of the younger people are interested in, is self-reflection. That's why Benjamin's still interesting to them, because it's a reflection and a self-reflection on the capacity of genres and forms and modes of distribution. I'm Esther Leslie, Professor of Political Aesthetics at Birkbeck, University of London, and I'm here with my co-host Stuart Jeffries, who's a journalist and a writer of many books, including Grand Hotel Abyss, which is a history of the Frankfurt School, of which Walter Benjamin, or Walter Benjamin, as we'll call him, was a part. We're here today because there's a reissue of a volume of Benjamin's stories and reviews around stories called The Storyteller, and this has been reissued by Verso and collects together a number of short-form pieces and quite enigmatic pieces that Benjamin wrote across the course of his career. I edited and translated that book together with Sam Dolbear and Sebastian Trusolawski. So perhaps we could start by talking about the idea of stories and where stories fit within Benjamin's broader set of thinking.
It's great to come across some of these pieces which I hadn't read before. Just the short, pithy, not gnomic little stories which have a great sort of narrative propulsion. He's just a beautiful writer. It's just one thing I wanted to say about him. He's a beautiful writer. But the other thing that strikes me is he's writing a lot of these stories when he seems to be, and the title, but the subtitle bears this out, Tales Out of Loneliness. He's on his own a lot, and he seems to be a very solitary person. But he's also very, he doesn't seem a clubbable person at all. And yet he's got incredible networks of friends who he's writing to and he's writing about.
That's one thing I find interesting. I mean, it's part of the nature of the life of the writer to be solitary, I suppose, in a sense, to sit there and write. But he's also a great exponent of the art of letter writing, to the extent to which the last book that he publishes, which is published by a Swiss publisher, I think, is letters from men and women of the 18th and 19th century, and he calls it polemically German people, because he's trying to establish this kind of alternative tradition of a Germany that has been utterly lost at the moment when he writes that book, as it's fallen to Nazism and so on, or curates that book. So he's fascinated in the letter form. The letter's interesting because it's both a solitary activity, but you're writing it for somebody else to read it. So it is part of a sort of delayed dialogue and gives a window onto these networks that he was involved with. And he, there are 6 volumes of the collected letters in German, and that's not even all of them, So it's this sort of constant activity of his to write to Scholem or Schön or Brecht or Adorno or Gretel Karplus and so on. So there are also these networks, but I guess what comes out of the collection of Storyteller is meditations on being alone, experiencing things alone, and then at the moment when he comes to write these stories, many of them are sort of refracted through the idea of someone telling a story to someone else, or a narrative within a narrative, these strange sort of framing devices. So even to be alone is always, in a way, to evoke a listener, I guess, or someone who needs to hear the story. So that produces a kind of network.
And that really connects with why he was drawn, I guess, to work in radio, because that is that sort of intimate, one-to-one contact. It's a very intimate medium. It's not like television, I suppose, which is more of a communal experience, or at least that's the idea of it. You know, certainly in Britain it was conceived of as being this sort of national unifying medium, whereas radio can be both more intimate and more expressive and more personal. And certainly a lot of the writings he did for radio feel like that to me.
Although, again, there's that weird ambivalence. We have a lovely little story in here, sort of on the minute, which is...
Oh, yeah, that's a great story. Yeah.
And I'm sure it's based on his experience of going into the Frankfurt radio station, and this man... he's broadcasting his programme, and he looks up at the clock and thinks he's only got, or he thinks he's gone too fast and he hasn't got enough of his papers left to read, and so he sort of stretches everything out with these long words and pregnant pauses, and then he realises he's misread the station clock.
Yeah, it's the second hand rather than the minute hand he's looking at.
And then, finds out afterwards, his friend tells him that the radio sort of broke down anyway during transmission. But it sort of brings out that thing that you're both alone, it's a lonely presentation, and you can only fantasize all these potential audiences that you have. But so it is both sort of, you're very intimate. And he says within that story, the station manager tells him, imagine you're speaking to just one person, being beamed into their living room as they sit there with their headphones on or next to their new loudspeaker. And so it's transitional at that stage, because people often used to, or sometimes would be reading the scripts along with the person who's reading it out to them. So this strange kind of communion between listening and reading and all of that. But essentially one's on one's own, confronted by a potentially sort of demonic or torturous technology.
Well, there's also, as a jobbing hack, I really identified with that idea. Well, you've got to write to length, you've got to hit the mark, you've got to finish it on time, otherwise there's going to be dead air, or more likely, if you're overwritten, you're going to get your piece hacked and butchered. And he's approaching this as he did a lot of sort of what I'm calling, hack work in inverted commas, because a lot of the writing he did, short form writing he did for newspapers, is beautifully written, but also he is a professional journalist, professional, again, unclubbable, freelance journalist. He wasn't really on the staff of anything, as far as I'm aware, apart from the magazines he briefly set up. He's talking all the time. I'm aware of him, not just as somebody who's sort of thinking about the audience, also sort of thinking about the people he's got to write for and how he's going to serve them in a way.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, at one point he dismissed, I think, in a letter, his radio broadcast as a kind of hack work or the work that you do to make money in order to eat, and it feels like he dismisses them. But as you say, in fact, his radio broadcasts are extraordinary. They're sort of miniaturized renditions of so many of his bigger and sometimes more complex themes. But I think it's true that once he was unable to get an academic career with his habilitation that he needed to teach, rejected, and he realised he was going to have this kind of freelance jobbing life, and then that all intermeshes with political turmoil in Europe, and he has to sort of flee and try to find places to exist. He gives himself over to that jobbing life, and I think that leads to his strong identification and interest in Baudelaire, similarly, as someone who, sells their columns or their poems to the press or to publishers, and there's great awareness of a sort of commodification of the task of writing and having to write to deadlines and to particular specifications, and radio is just a very extreme version of that in terms of the timings, but also the whole sort of hustle of just trying to get these jobs in the first place, and I think he's very much tied up with that.
He's also quite, he accepts the master narrative of German intellectuals at the time, which is that journalism is this impoverished language. That's what Karl Krause was talking about. Ironically, but all these people worked in journalism, so there's a kind of level of not exactly self-loathing, but a sort of they're doing things which in a way are beneath them, and yet at the same time are really important to them. These writings aren't just, to me at least, they don't read as just things he's done for money. They're beautifully turned and they're beautifully written. So there's a kind of interesting paradox there about they're working in forms that they kind of disdain, and the other thing that really strikes me as well is when we talk about his loneliness and the fact that he didn't get academic tenure or anything like that. That's partly, we've got to talk a bit about, I suppose, the fact that he's a Jew, and he's, for a long time when he was a young man, he didn't expect to be able to teach, I don't think, or get tenure, because Jews weren't allowed to do so at that moment. Later on in the Weimar Republic, I think I'm right in saying there was a short period where Jews were allowed to, get tenure. He never did, because his habilitation thesis was incredibly, insanely rejected, And so I wonder what his personality is like, really. Is he somebody who, because of his Jewish identity, because of the exclusive nature of German society and the latent anti-Semitic nature of German society, which becomes less than latent later on, is he somebody who's almost forced to become an outsider, or was it? It's an imponderable question. Or was it something that's about his personality beyond his Jewish identity?
I'm sure those two things interplay in a way, don't they? But I mean, I think it's interesting in his early years, he's around the youth movement, which is a sort of much broader movement, as imagining sort of the coming society as led by progressive youth who've shaken off the militarism of Wilhelmine society and all of that. So that's a sort of broader opening to, an alternative Germany. And, at this point, when he's a young man, he's looking back to these longer literary traditions, and they're very influenced by Ibsen and all sorts of impulses, and a sort of free-thinking boarding school that his parents sent him to. All of that, I think, occasions him to think quite strongly about the intersections of German life and German traditions, Jewish life, Jewish traditions, and whether there's something that's specifically German Jewishness or Jewish Germanness, and so on, and a whole kind of reaching out sort of much more broadly, I suppose, to imagine a future. But he has often also been seen, is it Susan Sontag's phrase, sort of saturnine, that he's dogged by a personal melancholy that's just part of his, myopic sense of being in the world. So his marginalisation, is socially occasioned by anti-Semitism, the fact he couldn't study for his PhD where he wanted to because of these, closed numbers of Jews who could be accepted to the university, and all of those things, external factors, also just his own burgeoning progressive politics, means that youth movement, wants to break with the Germany that has been, just as the sort of modernist impulses want to break with the Germany that has been, and that's a sort of self-made but voluntarily chosen cutting off. And then there's maybe the internal one of personality that you just can't help.
He breaks from his bourgeois background, the West End of Berlin, and his businessman father, as do lots of the people who went on to found the Frankfurt School. They're very often always sons of wealthy businessmen who rejected that way of living. But with him, it sort of induced him into an almost picaresque lifestyle where he becomes quite impecunious. He's never really relying on institutional support, living off his wits, and quite solitary. He makes himself into somebody who, and again, it's worth thinking about, I suppose, why he becomes somebody who's really interested in leaving Berlin, leaving Germany, and travelling to these different places, while at the same time having a sort of sense of, this is what I get from him and from a lot of the Frankfurt School as well, is that they're this, almost like the people who are safeguarding a kind of notion of German culture at a time when it's being abused and mobilised by the Nazis in a rather degraded way. I mean, that comes out a lot later on with people like Horkheimer, who explicitly see, when they're in Los Angeles in exile, they see themselves as their work is a message in a bottle to future generations, really. But also, when people like Thomas Mann and all those people who are in exile, they're thinking of themselves as safeguarding a German culture which has been disabused, and he's part unwittingly, because he dies in 1940. He's part of that, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Mann regularly comes to the BBC, doesn't he, and does these lectures about the other Germany, the Germany that should be. It's funny, when you said living off his wits, I thought you were going to say living off his wife, because there is also a little bit of because he does live off his wits, but it is also important that even after her divorcing him, he gets these handouts, and Dora, does, enable him to sort of try to sustain himself, and that's just all part of that extremely precarious situation of which does make it very canny. When he's in exile in Paris, he's sort of working out if he should go to this particular conference because they're going to give kind of free food, and that would sort of be helpful for a while, or should he go and hang out in the library because at least he's warm there. And it's that real kind of getting to know the city in the way he writes in the Arcades project, that in a way, if you're condemned to poverty and the streets, you make the streets into your living room, your vestibule, your this and your that. You learn how to use it because you have no other choice, and he does become very good at that. But I mean, while I think he wants to unbury an increasingly lost progressive liberal German tradition, I think he also wants to defamiliarize. And so, there's a point at which he writes, I don't want to write about Germany, I want to talk about, the French tradition, or going to Moscow and trying to understand what's happening in Russia. Or all of that work, I think, it in some ways it explains something very fundamental in him, which is this idea of wanting to dislodge from habit and to open oneself up to experience in the manner of a child. So it's very striking when he's in Moscow and gets quite excited by the idea of even having to learn to walk again on icy streets like a child learns to walk, and it's, or going to Ibiza or Naples, and that is also a strong German tradition from Goethe and everyone else of going south and enjoying the special light and so on. But it also just opens up to him how space can be differently inhabited, the porosity between public and private. All these things can be retabulated in ways that are so different from what he calls something like the race course of Berlin, or these sort of stripped back super modern spaces that have lost any relationship, say, to nature or to contingent and arbitrary form. And he's always looking for these other spaces, of these sort of curlicues where experience can expand. And sometimes I think that involves rejecting the Germany that rejected him as well. Yeah,
but he's also, there's an Oedipal thing, I suppose, because he's rejecting the world that his father created, I suppose. And when he refers to their villa as lying in I think something along the lines of a gilded ghetto, held on a lease, which is horrible to thought that it's probably a very short lease, That's all really, really pertinent and powerful. I just wanted to ask you a bit about his relationship with women, because he comes across sometimes as fairly misogynistic and fairly kind of exploitative of women, and yet he seems to have lots of affairs. He treats his wife fairly appallingly, I think we can say, and and also really interestingly, I think lots of the photos of him were taken by women. So there are women in his life all the time. And what's your take on his relationship with them?
He seemed to have strong friendships with women. I mean, he writes in some ways much more, certainly more intimately and extensively to Gretel Karplus, who's the wife of Adorno. He's so influenced by Helene Grund, the wife of Franz Hessel, but a fashion theorist, fashion journalist. And I think what's interesting, I wouldn't call him misogynist. I think he sort of falls wildly in love with women, and himself talks about the way in which they then utterly change him. So he says this about the Latvian theatre maker Asia Latsis. She sort of re-engineers him in some way, and together they write, and she's pretty spiky and sort of very ironic about him, and quite ridicules him in certain ways. So clearly there was an exchange of something between them. But I do think there's something quite strange about the whole circle from which Benjamin comes, and having spent the past few years looking together with Sam Dolbear at Ernst Schoen, who was Benjamin's best friend from childhood, and really the person who was an interlocutor sort of right the way through his life from adolescence onwards. Now, they came from the same circle in Berlin, interested in progressive politics, interested in Nietzsche and Baudelaire and all of this stuff. But what they effectively do their whole life long is sort of swap partners between each other, and everyone falls in love with the same girl, and then she then marries the brother of someone she was once in love with, and all sorts of things like that happen. There's something about, and maybe that is connected to this idea of a certain kind of isolation because of their high-minded intellectualism, because of their very self-conscious sort of sense of who they were. They could, in a way, only fall in love with each other. And
certainly by contrast with lots of the other, Frankfurt School critical theorists, he's quite a utopian, and in terms of technology, he embraces it. He embraced it in a childlike way, I think. What you were saying about his childlike, the openness to experience, and also to the transformative nature of experience, and the transformative nature of what, say, cinema could do, or what radio does, and the idea that these are technologies of these kind of, in modern terms, those sort of transhuman prostheses which are going to extend our ranges of perception, and all that's kind of liberating and revolutionary, and all that contrasts so markedly with the way in which Adorno and Horkheimer write about culture. They just see it as this industry which is actually just about creating a dominating. Hollywood cinema is never for them anything other than a machine to keep people in their place. It's not liberating. It's not experientially enriching. It's the opposite. Yeah. Whence is utopianism?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because for the rest of them, it's so much that the machine is rational, and it's instrumentalizing, and delimits the capacity for us to have experiences. And in part, Benjamin affirms that. I mean, in his writings on experience and poverty, he he sort of speaks about war technologies as sort of muting us and shattering our capacities. So, we acknowledge this kind of mortal battle between human and machine, but the way out of that is not to dismiss it and just, stay with our pure, untouched cultural materials, but sort of plough through it ourselves. And that's when he talks about Mickey Mouse and Adolf Loos and Paul Klee. These are all sort of figures who've somehow absorbed technology into themselves and then re-articulate it in surreal or absurd or honest ways in order to give us the basis to sort of build ourselves up again in partnership with it, because it doesn't disappear. And one of the things I love in Benjamin is his idea of sort of second technology, that, this is all just a process. So first technology comes and bombs us and straps us to the machine, so, we have to work to its rhythm and so on. But then we can sort of, get beyond that into a second wave of technology that instead of sowing bombs, sows seeds from the skies, and, instead of strapping us to the machine's rhythms, I don't know, maybe lets us go while it gets on with automating production and things like that. He's got a capacity or a desire, at least, to see that and to see that through. But I don't know where that comes from, except potentially, one of the things that did fascinate him was surrealism in a way that it did not Adorno, who was very dismissive of it. And I suppose I wonder if, effectively it's a kind of Dada surrealist take on the kind of ludicrous nature of what technology does to us, but then somehow we can take the ludicrous, take it into the realm of play and make something else of it. Because whenever he thinks of technology, Benjamin thinks of play and this little word Spielraum, a sort of room for maneuver, room for play, wiggle room. So it and that again goes back to his ideas of childhood and whereby he thinks, for children, they're born into a world where technology is just a kind of nature for them because they haven't seen it come. It's just part of their world, so they work with it. And I think maybe he's always trying to get back to that and put the best face on it.
It's a really interesting take, because the usual narrative with technological innovation is it starts off as promising liberation, and then all that gets destroyed. So, for example, you think of like John Ronson's book about social media. You've been publicly shamed. Starts off as this incredible utopian moment. It's going to transform us. We're all going to be empowered to express ourselves, and then it becomes the internet. Then it becomes the sort of techno giants that we know today. So, what's fascinating about what you just said is like he's flipping the whole narrative, Benjamin. He's saying that, well, that actually the machine needn't control us, and that's what's utopian in a way.
Yeah, and in a way, I suppose it's just a kind of Marxist point as well, isn't it? Because in his famous work of art, In the Age of Technical Reproducibility, he talks about the ways in which the development of machinery is impeded by the relations of production, and there's going to be that contradiction and that tension. So he sort of talks about capitalism's kind of violation of the apparatus, as if this machinery, could in a way be left to its own devices and develop it itself, and we would adjust to that, and it would improve conditions somehow under its own steam, quite literally, but capitalism keeps locking it back into profit motive and production of profit, and therefore the necessary social relations that come from that. And I think he's sort of drawn to that idea, and then I think takes it that really interesting direction in the epilogue to the work of art essay, where he's thinking about two types of representation and this sort of violation of the apparatus to show the Aryan German masses, under Hitler, sort of on screen. They've made an imprint on celluloid. It looks as if they've come to representation, but actually they're just being mobilised as a material to be seen in their sort of anonymous collectivity and their shaping by power, and it's no form of actual political representation, because the social relations within which that occurs, sort of capitalist fascist relations, is one that can't allow them any genuine articulation, because that would involve abolishing those very social relations.
That seems to connect with how the culture industries work through by Adorno and Horkheimer when they're thinking about when they make that explicit comparison between Ufer, some of the propaganda films, I don't know if it's Riefenstahl, but certainly Nazi propaganda films, and Charlie Chaplin. There's a sort of, for them, there's an impoverishment in terms of experience that comes from exposing yourself to those things, and that's where their sort of anti-utopianism, just completely depressed cynical sense of how technology is going to be imposed on the masses to control them comes from. I think it's just very easy for them to map, I think, what they saw in Germany, or what they saw as propaganda industry in Germany, and see that as being replicated somehow in Hollywood. I wonder if Benjamin would have seen it that way had he lived, or had he made it to exile, in the States.
Yeah, what do you think would have experienced the same extreme alienation, sort of under the blue skies of
yeah.
Los Angeles, and just sort of felt, most certainly his good friend Brecht would have told him about, every day I go to the marketplace to sell my lies and come home so disappointed and so on. They would have, I think he would have taken that stance as well, I suppose, that this is all about a chopping up and commodification of ideas, including, poetry and everything else. But I don't know, he might have found some other kind of accord with it as well, although he was absolutely horrified at the prospect, really, of leaving Europe. That's one of the great imponderables, isn't it? But I don't think he wanted to be in an English-speaking realm at all, really.
Yeah, there's no sort of happy story really of any of those exiles, or is there? But I was sort of thinking about Adorno in Oxford and how he hated it, and how alienated he felt in Los Angeles. And at the same time, they had something which I think they inherited from Benjamin, which is this kind of commitment to seeing themselves as safeguarding, we've talked about it before, German culture. Would Benjamin have been more open to, the oppositional voices that might be inherent in sort of certain kinds of popular culture that, Adorno and Horkheimer and I think Marcuse really didn't really get? Notoriously, Adorno had a tin ear for jazz, and yet he was in the West Coast, and he was getting a sort of, he could have heard these great musicians, he could have really experienced it, and yet he was almost, I think, poisoned against jazz by what he heard and what he perceived it as being when he was in Germany. I think it's like the German jazz bands, most of whom probably were white, and he didn't really understand, I don't think, what the social movements of, or what social critique popular culture could involve. I think he couldn't understand. Whereas I kind of had this romantic notion that maybe Benjamin would have got it more. Would have been more open to that kind of experience.
I think the potential was there. Even in the work of art essay, he talks about a public that's sort of reactionary in front of a surrealist work of art because they feel they can't understand it, or it's not good painting or something. Absolutely embraces Charlie Chaplin, or embraces Mickey Mouse cartoons, and effectively, it's the same formal things going on. It's the context within which that happens and that is different, and whether one feels that the work is made for one or whether one is excluded from it. So, I mean, I think he might have had more of an opening onto interesting formal inventiveness, but I think for all of that lot, they were completely immersed in certain kind of strictures from the past. So there's one time when Benjamin is doing his hashish experiments, I think those drug experiments that any kind of poetically tuned European of the time seemed to go through, and he sort of realises he's tapping his foot to music, and this is sort of a bit of a shock because you don't really respond in a bodily way to music, and it takes a huge hit of hashish to kind of release your organs to do that. So I think they are very tied up in ways that maybe hard to imagine now.
It's quite hard to imagine. I remember reading that Marcuse was given a copy of a Rolling Stones album when he was, the doyen of the New Left, and he completely freaks out. What is this? Because it didn't compute, really. And I interviewed Angela Davis, and she was talking about how, because I was saying, for you, because you studied with Marcuse and you venerated, or you studied with Adorno, when you kind of venerated Benjamin, read a lot of their work. What could their sort of criticisms of popular culture, and particularly African American popular culture, have meant to you? And she was she's fairly defensive in the sense that she said, they had this sort of German high cultural formation, which she thought they might be able to. They're starting to get beyond, or Marcuse at least was starting to get beyond, but not very much, I don't think. They didn't, because they were caught up in. Perhaps because the historical circumstance of thinking that they're defending German. I mean, this is my idea. I think them defending German culture against the depredations of Nazism and what Nazism did to Germany, and what Thomas Mann's perspective is. In his BBC broadcast was very much. This is what we're standing out for. What Germany is. What the Nazis are doing is disgusting and repellent. So. Maybe because of that preoccupation, they couldn't really expose themselves or try to grasp or understand empathetically what popular culture was, or American popular culture was, and saw it in a rather disdainful way. Although I do kind of think now, all the time I think we've been talking about that phrase that Marcuse had about the great refusals been going through my mind, which is that the working classes were a disappointment to Marxists. Ultimately, they didn't deliver what the Frankfurt School hoped for. Marcuse had a new faith in subaltern groups, by which he meant, I think, African Americans and feminists and so on, to lead to some sort of liberation. And actually, that's what they needed to think about, that and how popular culture can be used for those is being used and can be used by those subaltern groups to foment some sort of change in society. I kind of think that Benjamin would have been into that, more. Yeah,
I mean, he's cut off so early, really.
Yeah, right.
He? Dying in 1940, sort of at the start of war, before all of that post-war rearrangements comes into being, and he can only sort of participate posthumously. But it is very telling that in 1968, these oppositional groups in Europe, ranging from Baader-Meinhof group, the terror group, through student movement and so on, all grasp to Benjamin, find something really important there, do these posters famously with him with a Kalashnikov in one hand and a joint in the other, armed struggle and drugs, he's somehow our watchword, and a great emphasis on those writings of his that really are about, I suppose, politics of culture, his writings like The Author as Producer and the artwork essay, and thinking about the possibilities of reproduction, thinking about the photocopier as revolutionary tool, all of these sorts of things, because we get the means to reproduce our own ideas, circumventing the publishing presses and the television, the mass media, and these institutions that gatekeep. And and it is to Benjamin that is turned for both for kind of strategies as to how to communicate, and the forms of distribution and so on, and also for some of the content of that. So when he's thinking with Asiolatzis about proletarian theatre or photo montage a la John Hartfield and so on, Benjamin allows a whole set of oppositional and new groups, new social movements to rethink that stuff in his absence. Had he been there, I don't know how that would have changed things.
But one of his first sort of political organisations was when he was a student. He was a student leader campaigning against German universities being the sort of, producing next generations of, mandarins, really. So he's very much opposed to this instrumental conception, this nationalist instrumental conception of what education could be. And I think that's in a lot of the people who in the student movement in '68 were of the same mindset, that that's what was happening again. Adorno at that point, he's in a difficult position because while a great critical theorist and poised in I think 1968 to sort of start his lecture series on an introduction to dialectical thinking. He calls in the police because his lectures are being stopped, by student sit-ins. Students who, naively perhaps, but nonetheless ardently felt that tertiary education was being mobilised yet again to just serve a capitalist, industry, or to serve the bureaucracy, the things that they didn't think, education was for.
And it was through him that they learnt that critique, and that was the
irony,
irony, wasn't it?
Irony.
So
yeah.
He's the sorcerer's apprentice, but he's become an institution. They write that on the blackboards. Adorno as an institution is dead, So they are speaking in the name of the living Adorno, but that's right. The one who's producing his theory in some ways in opposition to Nazism, opposition to American capitalism as he understands it, and so on. But suddenly he becomes in that period, the representative again of order, and he's going on the radio, speaking about education after Auschwitz, and how we have to teach differently. But it seems as if he's not really taking his own words seriously, I suppose. And he's certainly not advocating sort of going onto the streets with Molotov cocktails and so on.
But Dan, this is a bizarre thing, but what would you have done? You've been working all summer on this incredible lecture series you're going to be doing about the introduction to critical thinking, and then suddenly, a bunch of these snotty students come in and just sit in, You'd be understandably cross, but on the other hand, what would you...
I'm not sure I would have called them red fascists.
That's right.
But, I think it's a hard one. We'd all like to think, would we all like to think? I'd like to think I would have somehow, opened up the institute and let them all sit there, and we would have all, done our teachings, and then eventually they would have wanted to go home to Daddy to get their clothes washed or something, and it would have all dissipated.
Yeah. Adorno was this great aphorist, I mean, Minimum Morale, one of the reasons for reading it is because it's just so pithy, and he's such a condensed, fabulous writer, Marcuse apparently said of him that everything he wrote, pretty much, he could just sort of send it straight to the printer, it was just sort of bang, he's really on the money. So in a way, I don't like to sort of say this, but had he not died, he could have been in the Twittersphere. In fact, there was this book that came out, and it was just called Nine, and his picture of him on the front going like that, and it was just lots of his pithier comments about the nature of the culture industry, anti-Semitism, the genesis of stupidity, and probably his remarks about Auschwitz and all that sort of stuff. So the idea of this is a crazy question. I'm going to ask it anyway. Could any of these guys have hacked it on Twitter, and or would they have been temperamentally opposed or politically opposed to it, while at the same time perhaps being temperamentally quite good at it?
So I remember once I really wanted to issue a whole load of Frankfurt School Christmas crackers, which would have had, and either it would have had the Adorno phrases like, I mean, they sound better in German. I think es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen. There is no right life lived in the false. Or they could have been sort of augmented to something like es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Grolschen. So in Grolsch, which was the beer of choice at the time I was drinking, one can find no right life. There is something, pithy and sloganistic. I mean, people do that anyway, don't they? You have various, whether they are real people or bots, tweeting out sort of the Adorno quote of the day. Whether they would have found that a useful mechanism. I mean, it's not a useful mechanism in the sense that it's just part of the flurry on the surface that only exists in order to feed the beast underneath it, which is now Elon Musk and whatever it was before that. I guess it's all just a kind of static, isn't it, that can't really or doesn't seem to organise, and because organisation has to overcome the kind of fragmentation, I guess, that this relies on, and that people become more and more aware of now that the social relations are much more open, because we all saw how this fell into private hands for whatever reasons, but you sort of see, or you understand it basically as an economic vessel that may or may not fail at being economically profitable, and you have no control over it, over what your thing appears next to, or what advert or sponsored thing is going to be thrust at you. So I think for those reasons, they would have probably held it at a distance, seeing it far too enmeshed in capitalist structures, as if Surkamp publishers or whoever else were not. But it at least feels like there's some distance between structures of economy and the output, whereas here it just feels like it's all collapsed in on itself.
Would they have been interested in the idea that this idea of self-performance and what is the real, at the same time there's this performance of authenticity as well as performance, this paradoxical thing about performing one's real self when actually it's another mask, and all of that sort of self-commodification. That would have probably interested them, I think.
I think it would have interested them. I think it would have that bleed between the self-presentation sort of through the filter, through the extreme curation of the self as image, then bleeding back into a world in which you use whatever techniques you can in order to also make that your external reality, because otherwise the sort of gulfs of disappointment between online and offline life are too wide. I just think all of that would have very much fascinated them, probably driven Adorno into some kind of overdrive, sort of, thinking about the fantastical manipulation of the surface of reality, and so on, and its sort of unbounded mediation.
Well, I don't know how it works in academia now, but certainly I remember when social medias first started, and journalists were encouraged to engage with it. I remember being told that it'd be really good if you set up a Twitter handle and started to engage with the below the line trolls, and which felt like this massive time suck, but also not just that, but it also felt really unpleasant. And so, as a sort of techno Luddite, I stepped away in a rather sniffy way, in a sniffy way, which I can imagine Adorno being, temperamentally suited to as well, which is that I didn't want to perform myself, and I also didn't think I could construct a persona successfully online that I would be happy to inhabit, So it felt like the opposite of what Bowie did, like Bowie just had picked up these different masks. I felt like I'd construct a mask, and then it would just stick to my face. You become this thing that you aren't. And I see it all the time now. I just see that people seem to have become a lot of the time on Twitter, become utterly monstrous. Maybe that's what they really were underneath, and it's just revealing what was repressed. Or more likely, you're encouraged to construct a persona which works online somehow, and you can sell it better, and it's more lucrative. Certainly with journalism, there was a period in which if you wrote articles, there was going to be an idea that you would be paid more money, you would get a performance benefit for performance-related pay based on the number of clicks you would get, and that was considered as a serious business model by lots of papers for a while. Something like that does happen, surely, throughout a lot of the way in which social media works now. And I bet you have to tweet probably because, or maybe you don't have to tweet. You tell me. It probably it doesn't necessarily help you get tenure, but it helps. It helps sort of publicise you, and you have to perform yourself as a bit of a brand in order to extol your cultural your content or whatever.
To some extent, I mean, I think that's I think these things are still sort of under negotiation, or but certainly. Everyone, I mean, academics are using that sphere for self-promotion, aren't they? But I mean, some, I think, keep a sort of aristocratic distance still, but it does seem aristocratic, I suppose, if you do. And we've all become, like Baudelaire, hawking our wares sort of on the market, or, indirectly sort of on the market through managing the brand. Yeah, it's true. Is
there anything to say, would Benjamin have found anything defensible in social media? That would he conceivably have found it, experientially enriching, or?
I mean, when you think back to his essay on the Storyteller, and he's juxtaposing sort of the fairy tale and the folk tale as these kind of conveyors of wisdom, which, in some ways works itself into the novel, but the novel is essentially a bourgeois form about the sort of self-education, self-development of an individual. So, and then he thinks about the newspaper and all of its fragmentation, all of its little articles, little bits, things next to each other, none of which relates to each other. And really that is just an explanation or a description of social media form, TikTok, sort of 15 second, each one different, and by the time you've seen the next one, you've forgotten what the last one was, and this sort of endless flow. So it's like that structure of the newspaper that he's describing, but absolutely, maxed and amplified. And he doesn't dismiss the newspaper as a realm. It might be a la Karl Kraus, it's sort of the cliche and the phrase, and it's manipulative, and it's just sort of ends up confusing rather than informing us, or information itself becomes degraded, and it's nowhere near wisdom. But I'd say that these are the times we live in, so we have to sort of work through that, or see if there are ways of reinventing that, which he does see with Tretyakov and the Soviets and the worker authored newspaper and so on. So maybe he'd find some kind of hinge into these media forms. I do find it interesting that, having teenagers, myself currently, one of the ways in which they find out about Benjamin Adorno
Yeah.
is through tweets or through book talk or through online stuff or even YouTube videos. And had one thrust at me the other day, which was dealing with Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And so that's all Walter Ong and McLuhan and so on. But and there's Benjaminian stuff in there, and these are actually much longer form and probably only watched by certain kinds of kids, but it's done in a really engaging way, and it's self-reflecting back, because this is what it seems to me a lot of the younger people are interested in, is self-reflection in all its forms, self-reflection, their own self-reflection through these media, but also how the media self-reflects on its own constitution. And this that's why Benjamin's still interesting to them, because it's a reflection and a self-reflection on the capacity of genres and forms and modes of distribution.
How old are your kids?
15 just last week and 17.
Wow. I mean, if they can talk that way at that age and they're that steeped in those guys, it's fantastic. But we're going to talk a bit about radio, and just his perspective on what radio was and what is, and its liberatory possibilities, and just this idea, because you've written about Ernst Schoen recently, or you've got a book coming out to do with Schoen, who exiled, lived here, and did a lot of stuff for the BBC. Would Benjamin have shared the kind of Reithian edicts that one of the things that was supposed to be wonderful about the BBC and radio was that it would bring to the masses in a rather patrician sort of conceived way sort of serendipitous things which they wouldn't have otherwise encountered. Say you would turn on the radio and you'd hear some opera and you'd never heard opera before, that kind of thing. And the idea is that perhaps that is in an age now of we're in our silos, we're in our echo chambers. That serendipity, which is worth defending, perhaps, is lost. Would Benjamin have? Would he have been a Reithian in that sense? Probably not very.
I suspect not. It's Ernst Schoen who gets Benjamin onto the radio. In the sort of mid-20s up until even the start of 33. Doing all these extraordinary talks about the Caspar Hauser or Berlin dialects, or the an ironworks or a flood in Mississippi in 1927, and these are all quite, they're about catastrophes, or they're about swindler types, they're about the capacity to be deceived, they're quite odd little lectures, stories that, and some of that work is also sort of working together with the players in this new radio culture who are reading the equivalent of the Radio Times and writing in and having their compositions read out on the radio. And Schoen makes this possible for Benjamin, and it's sort of part of a moment of a kind of experimentalism where no one's quite sure what this radio can be, and what Schoen really wants to push, and what Benjamin really likes, is this idea that there is a radiophonic culture, something that is made specifically for radio and can only take place through radio, and it might involve sound effects, or it might involve certain kinds of editing, or certain kinds of recording, or electronic instruments, and all of those things. And I think that's an experimental interest that's there for 10 years under Weimar. When Schoen comes to the BBC, he doesn't find that kind of experimental ground, and it's although there are experiments and there is radical radio and there is interesting stuff, but he can't really find a more curatorial and operative role. So he becomes very much, someone who's scribbling down what the Nazis are broadcasting in order to communicate that up the food chain and things like that. I think there's a kind of horror for Benjamin and others of something that will come to be called middlebrow culture, and I think that would be the fear.
Right.
The BBC is just going to be,
that, yeah.
Issuing this sort of, very Reithian, consciously self-improving culture, but within sort of narrow parameters, and never should it sort of smack of a kind of critique of the social. I mean, there are moments when I think it does it extraordinarily. Sort of Ewan McCall spliced documentaries sort of opening up onto sort of, working life. Things like that do get through, but it's not the general thrust, I think, of the station. I think that's why Schoen finds it hard, and I can't quite imagine Benjamin doing the kind of lectures that he did in Germany. But who knows? If he had been here, then he might have changed things as well. So
I mean, he wasn't very good at performing himself, really, for his masters. He, all the way through from like German tragic drama, rejected as a thesis because it wasn't really in the style that was demanded. And the idea that he could have, when you come across his radio broadcasts, you just think these are wonderful, but I've no idea how they would fit into a radio culture now at all.
And
our loss,
Yeah, and no idea how he would have performed them as well. I mean, it's so frustrating that no one has ever come across any recording of these. So we can't know how he would have read them, how radiophonic he was. He was fascinated by this idea of the radio voice and the intimacy of that going into people's living rooms and so on, but quite how his own one hit home is lost to us for now, at least.
Thanks very much for listening to this kind of crazy podcast. And this is the book we've been talking about. It's a reissue of The Storyteller, which is just so beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful book with illustrations by Paul Clay. Available at all good booksellers.